Good morning, Dan and Amy. So, Mother Teresa on Sunday became Saint Teresa of Calcutta. The Pope in a canonization mass for Mother Teresa at St. Peter's Square. 120,000.
Wow.
Some turned out for the service. And, before there was Ben Carson dressing down a president at a national prayer breakfast, there was Mother Teresa doing it to Bill and Hillary Clinton. Really didn't dress them down. She just kind of made a statement of faith. But in that room with a pro-abort president and a first lady, it was, something along the lines of what Ben Carson did a few years back to rise to additional national prominence. Mother Teresa, the 94 prayer breakfast, talking about life.
And by abortion, the father is told that he does not have to take any responsibility at all for the child. He has brought into the world that father is likely to put other women into the same trouble. So abortion just leads to more abortion. Any country that accepts abortion is not teaching its people to love one another, but to use any violence to get what they want. This is why the greatest destroyer of love and peace.
Hillary Clinton alluded to Mother Teresa's speech almost 10 years later in her memoirs, calling Mother Teresa unerringly direct. She admitted the two did not agree on the issue of abortion. No kidding. Hillary Clinton writing, she agreed with my views on a woman's right to choose. She disagreed with my views on a woman's right to choose, and she told me so. Mother Teresa never lectured or scolded me. Her admonitions were always loving and heartfelt, said Clinton in her memoir, adding that she had the greatest respect for her, meaning Mother Teresa's opposition to abortion. It's interesting how that respect is not conferred to others who are pro-life from Hillary Clinton. But I mean, she's a congenital liar, so how can you believe anything she says? It's just whatever's convenient in the moment.
What did President Obama have to say about the canonization of St. Teresa?
He was busy providing some commentary on the backup quarterback for the 49ers and what he had to say
the team.
about police brutality and the like. So he couldn't be bothered to wax philosophic about Mother Teresa and her import in an ecumenical sense. But somebody who can do that is one of the most important conservative thinkers in the world, and one of the most important thinkers in academia, really. He is Professor Robert George. I don't mean to be too too friendly.
Robbie.
Whoa, wait.
What up?
He is the McCormick professor, McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence, and the founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He also was Mother Teresa's counsel of record with respect to her amicus curiae brief that she filed with the Supreme Court in 1994, arguing for the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And we're pleased to be joined by the aforesaid Professor Robert George. Professor George, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back on the show, Amy and Dan. Thanks for having me.
Your reflections on Mother Teresa, now St. Teresa's canonization, and just your personal experience. You had personal experience with her like few have had, and your reflections.
Well, it was a great day, and I think the Church has done a great thing in canonizing her. Of course, the theory of Catholic canonization is that the Church doesn't make a person a saint. A person is a saint if they've lived a saintly life, a life of heroic virtue, given testimony to faith in God, and the Church then recognizes that. And then that person becomes a model. It becomes an example, not simply for Catholics, but for everybody. I mean, think of some of the great saints of history, such as St. Augustine, who are revered not only by Catholics, but by Protestants, by Jews, by Muslims, by members of other faiths. And Mother Teresa, it's very fitting in this case, because even before her canonization, Mother Teresa was praised and revered and treated as a role model by Christians, by Sikhs, by Hindus, by members really of all faith, and of some people who have no faith at all, but nevertheless admired her willingness to sacrifice her own comfort, to devote her own life to the care of the weakest, the poorest, the most vulnerable, the dying, the outcast, the untouchable. It was a life of heroic virtue, and recognizing that as the life of a saint is a wonderful thing for the church to do.
Well, how did Mother Teresa receive her calling? What was her moment where she decided to devote her life to others?
She grew up in what was not yet and would now is no longer Yugoslavia. Her parents were Albanian. They were Albanian Catholics. And as a young girl, she was brought up in the faith, and as a young girl, she decided to become a nun. It was not uncommon in those days in that part of the world, so she found her vocation. What's interesting, though, she joined an order, and the order sent her off to do some missionary work in India. And when she saw the destitution, the poverty, the people gravely ill, lepers being uncared for, she felt a calling to make that her own life's work. So instead of staying with the order she was in and being brought back to Europe, she decided that she would start her own order of sisters. They are now known as the Missionaries of Charity, and that she would recruit her sisters not only among the European Catholics, but from people in India, the native population, and really eventually from people all over the world. And that's how she became Mother. Sister Teresa became Mother Teresa as the foundress of the order, the Missionaries of Charity. And they didn't just restrict their work, Amy, to India or to people who were suffering from leprosy or in that grave poverty. When the AIDS epidemic hit in the 1980s, here in the United States and elsewhere in the West and in Africa, it was the Missionaries of Charity that led the way of all private organizations, led the way providing care for suffering, dying AIDS patients, especially when there was no treatment for the disease. When people were just dying with nothing that could be done, those sisters cared for them. And when other people were treating them as lepers for fear of getting the disease, those sisters cared for them.
As you're describing, Mother Teresa lived a life of heroic virtue and service, but that doesn't mean, she's still a human being, and it doesn't mean there weren't crises of conscience from time to time. And I wonder if you could speak to that too, because those are perhaps less discussed. And it maybe has relevance for us mere mortals about dark moments and crises in conscience and how you marshal through them.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you've invited me to talk about that, because perhaps that is the most important and least well-known part of her legacy. Here's the truth of the matter, Dan. Mother Teresa lived most of her life in a state of feeling alienated from God. Most of her life, she felt God's absence rather than God's presence. It's amazing. When she was young, she had two very profound experiences of the presence of God, and those helped to shape her life and shape her vocation. But then they stopped. When she was very young, she just had the two experiences, and then they stopped. And there were decades upon decades of spiritual dryness when she could not feel God's presence, but rather his absence. And yet, she clung to her faith. She trusted God. She placed her hope in him, even when she felt him absent rather than present. Those who have doubt, those who believe themselves to be atheists, Mother Teresa is your patron saint. She's the patron saint of the people who feel there is no God, or that God is absent, or that God doesn't care or isn't in their lives.
I just want to switch gears while we have you, slightly switch gears, and Phyllis Schlafly passing away over the weekend, a kind of ironic timing, and a contemporary and somebody that was involved in a lot of the spiritual/political battles that you've also been involved in, and your reflections on her life and times.
Well, she lived to be 92, a grand dame of the conservative movement. Of course, I think she will be remembered above all for her prescience, her foreknowledge. She opposed the Equal Rights Amendment and waged a virtual single-woman campaign against it. when it looked like it would be impossible to stop it. And she did that. Not because she opposed equal rights for women. She herself was the product of a kind of equal rights movement for women that had been unfolding in the West over many decades and centuries. She was extremely well educated at Washington University and at Harvard. She wrote A Choice, Not an Echo for Barry Goldwater. She was very much involved in politics. But when it looked like there was nothing that could stop the ERA, she nevertheless opposed it, and she opposed it because she felt that it would lead to a justification for abortion, the legal requirement of legal abortion. She felt that it would result in women being drafted for combat in the military. She felt that it would result in men being allowed in women's bathrooms. And, of course, she was ridiculed and mocked for these claims. They said she was scaremongering. They held her in contempt for saying these things. Well, now we're in 2016, and of course everything she predicted, even though she was able to stop the ERA, everything she predicted has come true. Women are not only in combat, there's now a very strong movement with powerful Republican as well as Democratic support to include women in a draft, if there is a future draft. I don't need to tell you how the abortion license has metastasized, and of course we now have this idea that anybody can be in any restroom they want so long as they identify with the gender identity of that particular restroom. So there, she saw it all coming. She did the best to stop it. Yeah.
All right. He is Professor Robert George. He is the McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence at Princeton University. His latest book, Conscience and Its Enemies. Professor George, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.